Good morning. Our first panel is about democracy, markets, and constitutions. I'm an economist, and I'm extremely interested in understanding the connection between markets and law and institutions that guide the markets and provide the framework. Comparisons between the EU and the US are always fruitful and always lend themselves to lots of learning. I won't take up much time here, and as Michael said, my main job is to keep the panel on track. With that, I'm passing the torch to Alistair to my left, and we'll have every panelist present some remarks, and then we'll get into discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Catherine, and good morning, everybody. First, if I may, well, it's a great honour to start to get the ball rolling on this occasion. I can't tell you how happy I am and relieved in some respects also to be back here after the post-COVID gap. And I'd like to thank Mike and Don and Craig, who I haven't met before, but Mike and I are old friends. And I've always enjoyed these events enormously, whether they've been in Germany or here. And so it's wonderful to be here again, and you've got a fantastic program. I'd also like just to say a word, if I may, with great respect, for Nino Scalia, who I was fortunate enough to meet on a few occasions. And I remember meeting him in Edinburgh, Scotland. I think he was awarded an honorary degree, but in any event, he gave a fantastic lecture there. And I remember suggesting to him that he should have a sabbatical from the US Supreme Court and sit for a year in the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, because then he would learn all about teleological interpretation of treaties. And then in exchange, somebody from the European Court of Justice could come to Washington and learn about strict construction of constitutions. But he didn't take me up on the offer, and it never went forward. But in any event, it's an honour to be here in the Nino Scalia law faculty. This is a pivotal moment in Europe. I'm 79 years old. I was honoured recently by the Belgian bar, and when the bâtonnier made his presentations, he said, Mr. Sutton was born in the last days of the Second World War, and he's devoted his whole life professionally to the European reconstruction. And there were tears rolling down my cheeks when he said that. I have never known a time like this. And this, in many ways, as Mike was saying yesterday, is not an easy time to organize a conference at the end of June, beginning of July, and all the rest of it, but it's a fantastic program. And with an election coming up here, an election in a couple of days in the UK, a recent election in the European Parliament, France in a couple of days. I mean, honestly, there are elections all over the place. So this is pivotal, but it's pivotal in another way. I think this is the first time that the European project, as I like to call it, is under threat, an existential threat. I'd never thought in my lifetime, I don't think many people did, even with Russian troops massing on the northern border of Ukraine, that we would ever see a conventional land war in Europe in my lifetime. I thought that was done and dusted, and we were living in an era of peace, unprecedented in Europe and the world for a long time. But that's not the case. And there is an existential threat now to the European project and to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and possibly Poland, and possibly Moldova, possibly Romania, and possibly Bulgaria. So this is certainly a pivotal moment. Transatlantic relations have never been more important. I remember with enormous pride, enormous pleasure, sitting with Bob Strauss in Geneva in 1977 when he said, Alistair, I want you to open our law firm in Brussels. And I never did get to open the Aiken Gump law firm in Brussels, but he inspired me to go into the practice of law after my time in the European Commission. But I remember working with the American delegations in Geneva in those days on the Tokyo round and the Uruguay round, and it was a fantastic pleasure. It wasn't that we fought with great pleasure, but then we made it up over red wine in the evening. And we saw international multilateral trade develop under the GATT and the WTO. Things aren't that bad now, but they're not good. We're talking about strategic autonomy. We're talking about European sovereignty. We're talking about onshoring supply chains and all the rest of it. Okay, the question, which some of you will have read for this panel, is basically about comparing the EU and the US. And the word constitutionalization comes up. But this is in the broader context, if you will, of democracy, markets, and constitutions, as Catherine has just said. And I was really attracted by this subject because in my mind, and I said this in the longer version of the notes which I've circulated to you, or which have been circulated to you, these three concepts are really relevant in the Brexit process. Brexit, which has damaged Britain, has damaged Europe, and has damaged NATO, and has damaged the transatlantic relationship. We needed the UK to lead in Europe. They never did. They have never had a European policy, not since 1900, and they never got one after the war, and they never got one when they joined the European Union. They allowed the French to lead in European integration, which Macron still attempts to do. So the Brexit process was characterized by the inadequacy of an unwritten, largely unwritten British constitution with a mix of binding rules, non-binding conventions. The democratic legitimacy of the Brexit process is flawed because of the lies and misrepresentations which were told by both sides in the process, and the fact that none of the people, very few of the people who voted had a clue what they were voting about. It was a non-binding referendum, as I say, based on factual and legal misrepresentations. There was never a consultation on what we would do if we left, and that is still the case. The UK are dithering and wittering around, not knowing where to go next. There's been a fragmentation of markets. In the UK, the four nations are divided, especially Northern Ireland, which is a part of the EU. Can you imagine a province like Hokkaido being a province of China? It's not conceivable. The EU, democracy, markets, and constitutions. We have no constitution. I want to be very clear about that. The member states, France and Netherlands particularly, voted against a constitutional treaty in 2005, May 2005. We have a democratic base. Democracy is not about the leadership only. It's about the people who make up the democracy learning and understanding and voting on the basis of proper understanding of what they're voting for. It's a two-way street, is democracy. And the recent European Parliament elections have been very interesting. I know Catherine's watching the clock very carefully, but I want to refer you to a study which I read recently done by a French foundation based, and the study was conducted by Ipsos. I'm not a great psephologist, but I believe it is a good study. And it had some very, very interesting results, which show that in 27 member states and in the United Kingdom, there is more support for the political process of Europe than there is for national governments, or rather there is more respect for the EU institutions than there is for national governments. The one exception was Luxembourg. Every other state, the 28,000 people who voted, men, women, young, old, rural, urban, they all voted for NATO, for the EU, against a Brexit. Only 13% voted for a further exit. So the support for Europe, if you believe that opinion poll, is very strong. Of course, the opinion poll was done after Ukraine, okay? So that's clear. The US, for us, is not legally or constitutionally a comparator, but it is economically. When I worked with Lord Cockfield in 1985, we used the United States market as a comparator for our single market. In fact, we went further. We didn't have a Glass-Steagall. You did. We aimed for a financial services market which had no frontiers whatsoever and where people could buy insurance from north to south, from east to west. Niamh Maloney will talk about that tomorrow. It's a failure. Well, it's not a failure, but it's not a success. And so we use the US because I just come back from 5 years in Japan, and I could see from Asia how weak Europe was. We were on a protectionist road. And the single market project, which was where we abolished frontiers in 1993, 1st of January, for the first time in history, Europe was back with no passports, free movement, goods, persons, services, capital. Now recently, people have realized, 30 years on, it hasn't been going well. We've got a free market in goods, but services is hopeless. Energy, environment, financial services, and many, digital. We have the regulations, but does the single market really function? What about law enforcement? Law enforcement is weak. The Commission can't do it all. It's got to be done nationally. I strongly believe in a European Union of 450 million citizens, 27 states with 10 waiting in the sidelines. We're looking at a union of 40 states pretty soon. We need regional institutions. We need regional courts. How do you want people to understand what goes on in Brussels? You have a federal system with a federal judge sitting there, and two federal judges here, actually, one from Chicago, one from Washington, but you've got them all over the country. So people are linked into the federal system, even if people in Ohio don't know Washington very well. They have a federal link. We need that. Right. So thank goodness, the present Commission under von der Leyen has said, right, we need a new roadmap for the proper single market, a really functioning single market. Your GDP is growing at twice the pace of us in Europe. We cannot face the Chinese and the Russians without economic competitiveness. How do you want to pay for a defense industry without having a functioning economy where there is growth, where there is full employment? It's all right to have social values. That's terrific. But we need more than that. We need growth. We need innovation, R&D. We don't want our companies investing all around the world and not in Europe because they make more money. We want more investment in Europe. On constitutions and markets, then, we've had a Letta report now. Letta was the former Italian prime minister, and he's made a series of bold proposals for completing the single market. It now remains to be seen whether the politicians in the new mandate, which is starting in a few months' time, in November, new commission, new council, new parliament elected. We have to get the commission elected. So this is a very bad time to have a hiatus in European governance, I have to say, with the Russians making ground in Ukraine. It's no time to be looking at our navels, frankly, but that's the way it is. Just a quick word on the Constitution. We don't have a Constitution. Our Constitution, if you want to call it that, is made up of a bunch of treaties. If you read those treaties, you will see that the substantive provisions of our treaties on issues like education, energy, goods, services, telecoms, defense, the whole caboodle, go far further than your Constitution. Your Constitution is primarily about institutions and procedures. It is not about substantive rights. We'll talk about the Commerce Clause later, probably. But our treaty is a classical international law treaty. What is different is that our Court of Justice, 60 years ago, voted for a unique form of international treaty which has direct effect in the legal systems of our member states, with supremacy of EU law over national law, direct effect of EU law in national law. Direct effect. That is why national judges, national governments have to enforce the law as well as the Commission. Okay? The question was, are the choices of the member states reduced? Of course they're reduced. When you sign a treaty, you curtail your sovereignty in some shape or form. The whole question is whether the balance is right, okay? Whether the balance between the Brussels institutions, the EU institutions, and the national institutions, whether that's a correct balance. I submit that it is, okay? Why? We've had 12 intergovernmental conferences, okay? We've modified our treaties 5 times, ending with the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. That's the current constitution, if you will. We've had 7 enlargements, starting with the UK in 1973, ending with Croatia in 2013, going from 6 member states to 28 and now 27. The fact that the UK could withdraw shows that it's not a constitution, it's a classical treaty, okay? Last word on democracy, an appropriate place to finish. On democracy, I watched the night before last in Brussels, Sunak-Starmer. I wouldn't vote for either of them, to be honest, but at least they had all their marbles. Last night, I watched the debate on television here, and respect for the country I am visiting at the moment precludes me from making any comment at all, except to say that I am 79 and I wouldn't dare take on what Joe Biden is trying to take on, but that's another matter. Democracy is fragile all over the world. The 6th of January is my birthday, and I will never in my lifetime forget 3 years ago, was it 3 years ago? Yeah, watching the storming of the Capitol. I could not believe that that was happening. I just sat in utter incredulity. The British Constitution is fundamentally flawed, and we have populism, as you can see from Nigel Farage. Populism in Italy, populism in France, populism in Germany, the AfD. What I told you is, though, that the young people of Europe, with Russia at the doorstep, realize that we are made up of 40 small countries. No one of us standing alone can stand in the world. We need somehow to work together. That implies a sharing of sovereignty. That's what we have. Is it perfect? It sure as hell isn't. Is it okay? Is it workable? Yes. Political will is all that is needed. I saw political will in action between 1985 and 1992. Fantastic. 12 member states. Political will between former communist Warsaw Pact Comecon countries in the East and France and Germany without the UK as a balancing factor, okay? That is much more difficult, generating that level of political will. And when you've got Hungary and Slovakia actively voting against you, we need to use Article 7 of the treaty to say to Mr. Orban and Mr. Fico, you don't like it, you know where you can go. We will suspend your voting. And if you don't if you don't respect European values, we don't need you here. And so what's going to happen in the constitutional reform that we're going to have, I use the word, excuse me, we're going to have qualified majority voting. It's the only way forward with 40 states. You cannot have unanimity in a world dominated by China, the United States, and to a lesser extent Russia, and the global south. Don't forget India, don't forget Brazil, don't forget Egypt, don't forget Indonesia. You won't, of course. I'm finishing. I'm happy to be here to make one small contribution to strengthening the transatlantic relationship. It is the most important relationship in the world. Mike Mansfield used to say that about US-Japan relations when I was there, but he was wrong. Well, maybe he wasn't wrong. You have an enormous responsibility in the world. Do not abdicate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alistair. Let's go to Bill.
Well, can you hear me? Okay, good. Alistair began by saying that the European project is in jeopardy. I would say that the American project is as well, although I would argue for opposite reasons. I have 10 minutes, which should be enough for me to make 3 points. Point number one is an historical point. In the past 90 years, we have gone through in the United States a massive movement towards the nationalization of policy. This has occurred, in my view, in 5 waves. The first, starting in the 1930s, was economic. Let's call that Commerce Clause nationalization. The second, starting in the 40s and increasing in the 1950s, was this distinctive kind of nationalization produced by the first war in history after which the United States did not demobilize, on the foundation of which was built the national security state that we have to this day. The third wave of nationalization occurred during the civil rights period, when it was argued successfully and correctly that there were certain forms of diversity in the United States of the 1950s that were intolerable from a constitutional as well as a moral point of view. The fourth wave of nationalization really got underway in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, which extended federal programs into areas previously dominated, in some cases exclusively, by the states and localities. And the fifth, it seems to me, symbolized by Roe v. Wade and the cultural conflicts that it spawned and other conflicts for which it provided a template, moved the nationalization into the cultural realm. And my question is whether this 90-year cycle of nationalization has hit a wall. In some respects, has it gone too far? and is inflicting damage on the republic that it was meant to improve. Now, in some respects, the answer to that question must be no. And this is my second point. But in other respects, yes. On the no side, what I've called Commerce Clause nationalization isn't going anywhere. There may be nips and tucks, but I think it is a fixture of our national affairs and, should I say, our national constitution. I say that it would have been true if the point I'm about to make had not happened. And that is the end of what's tendentiously, but it's the word in play, so I'll use it, the end of neoliberalism as the dominant political economic orientation in both political parties. And its replacement by an emerging new consensus that government has a considerably larger role in the economy, whether on the investment side or the protection side, than it was thought appropriate during the halcyon days of the 1990s and until the Great Crash and the financial crisis. And the third respect in which the national project is here to stay, I think, is in the military and defense side. We are in the 1990s with a minus sign. The threats are not disappearing, they're popping up. And the idea that we can meet them even minimally while backing away from major investments in national defense and in international alliances strikes me as quite fanciful. But in other respects, I think the national project has hit a wall. How much time do I have left?
3 minutes.
How much?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Why is that? Well, I think a leading indicator is the sharp decline of trust in the government at the national level. 60 years ago, the national government was the most trusted level of government. Now, by far, it is the least trusted. The closer American government gets to the people, the more trusted it is in the current dispensation. I could go through a long analysis as to why this decline of trust in government at the national level has occurred, but it is a warning sign. I would argue, and each one of these arguments is a proxy for a paper, if not a book, that rising political polarization in the United States has led to declining performance. For various reasons, some ideological, the multiplication of veto points in our system has also led to declining performance. At the national level, the government is unable to respond quickly and nimbly and flexibly to problems that require all three of those adverbs. There have also been jurisprudential changes that I think point to emerging difficulties for the national project. Time limits, judicial time limits on things like aspects of our voting rights legislation and also civil rights legislation such as affirmative action. And, as I'm sure everybody in this setting is aware, critiques of and rising limits on what is called the administrative state, including a very important Supreme Court decision that was handed down just yesterday, the Jarkissi case, which prohibits the SEC from serving as judge, jury, and executioner when civil damages are at stake. It's the law courts or nothing. And I think this will ripple through. This brings me to my third and concluding point. I believe this is a project that it is time to give renewed, serious attention to the virtues of federalism within the national project that the U.S. Constitution represents, and to do this in a, broadly speaking, Augustinian spirit, which, to remind you, calls for unity in all things necessary, diversity in all things possible, and in all things charity. And I will conclude with a moral point, and that is, in the absence of charity in the management of our differences, almost nothing is possible.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you so much. And I think Gareth has some interesting thoughts on to follow up on what you were just saying, Bill. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's on, isn't it? Yes. Good morning. And first of all, thank you to Craig and Mike for giving me the kind invitation to be here. I suppose I'm going to make a contrast with the United States. Well, having just heard Professor Goulston, maybe the difference is less than one suspects. That's often the way with these things. The European internal market has two purposes, or one could say it has two purposes. Partly that's to get the benefits of economic openness and integration, increased wealth and so on, but also it's a project of social integration to bind the peoples of Europe together. The perception being partly that if you have complete economic openness without a degree of social cohesion, the whole thing will blow apart. It becomes intolerable. People don't accept the competition. And it's often commented Americans don't have this problem because they already have a common language, common culture, common identity, but Europe doesn't, so they have to build that as they build their market. The means of doing this is what is in European parlance typically called free movement. You could also call it free trade or openness. The free movement emphasizes in a way how it's very much seen as an individual right, more than a sort of macroeconomic policy. And that's basically the free movement of all the Marxist factors of production, goods, capital, persons, services. The idea that anything which might hinder their movement should be abolished, and that's been it's been interpreted in a very far-reaching way, even more far-reaching than the Commerce Clause, I understand, to impact on just about everything that states do. In doing this project, and that's very much the European way of thinking about it, the project of building this market, there's an assumption, at least at EU level, that this is a kind of a cooperative partnership, that, after all, the member states chose to be members. We're all doing it together, that the EU has a role and the member states have a role and they work together. So the EU has the easy part, basically. It makes big general rules, either from the court or by a legislative process. It generates rules on everything. I'll come to that in a second. On how free movement should be implemented and all of the other aspects of this. And then the member states implement this. They translate this into their local national laws, and also they adapt to it, because the rules require adaptation typically. They require changes in institutions and in behaviours at the national level, and it's up to the member states to do that. And they should compensate, because the rules are disruptive, so they create losers, and losers aren't acceptable in European politics. So that means that it's up to the member states to then find mechanisms to compensate for this and maintain a degree of equality and social justice and so on. So that's their task. Europe thinks the big ideas and the member states work it out. And in principle, if you are a sort of university lawyer or an abstract thinker and you look at it on paper, it's all perfectly possible. But it's not really working very well. Now, that's my one simple point. First, I should emphasize, I'm not sure, maybe having heard Professor Goulston, maybe it is quite similar in the US. It's a very big task, because this understanding of a common market, for one thing, there's a low tolerance for economic diversity in Europe, and that means you have to harmonize the conditions of competition. And so creating an internal market has meant legislation on environment, on labor law, on pretty much anything you can think of, whether it's sort of like, rules on speed limits, because cars driving faster pollute the air more and so on, and that leads to high levels of pollution, or sex discrimination. It's all broadly within this economic project to some extent. So you've got this kind of stuff. You've also got rules on free movement which impact on big state activities like health, education, pensions. They're all supposed to be mobile. You should be able to go to a doctor anywhere in Europe, go to a university anywhere in Europe, take your pension anywhere in Europe. That's quite a big deal in implementing that, and so on. And they're moving into tax, corporate law, data protection. There's an endless stream of law coming out from the court and from the legislation. Now, in principle, I say it as an EU lawyer, always look at these rules and think, yeah, it can be done. You can reconcile, you can have all good things at once. You can implement this regulation and still maintain whatever, equality and social opportunity and protect your interest in your institutions. It can be done on paper. In practice, it turns out member states can't do it. And there's a number of things going wrong. Firstly, when it comes to implementing rules, which means taking these big abstract rules which say that you should have a common standard for the levels of this toxin in foods or whatever it might be, or common standards on X, Y, Z, translate it into national law. This turns out to be a really big project, which member states are over-enthusiastic about it, and they're becoming stupider. So ministries that used to be spending their time thinking, what's a good education policy? What's a good policy on data protection? How should we manage our farming sector? And sometimes, on a good day, being original and creative and coming up with well-working policies, now spend all their time implementing EU law. Basically, it's like some kind of sort of Soviet corporation. They spend all their time, or any corporation, they're all Soviet, really, aren't they, corporations? But they basically spend all their time trying to work out, what are we supposed to be doing? How do we follow the rules? And it is actually killing their ability to make autonomous, creative policy and to think for themselves. Member states are becoming stupider, and that's an unintended side effect of this process. And the other thing is the adaptation. And I say the adaptation is possible on paper, but particularly living in the Netherlands, which is a small and a very dense country in which basically everyone's involved in everything all the time. It's also not very hierarchical. I really become aware of how it's impossible to change anything in a European state. Modern European states, I think it's fair to say, are the most ambitious on the planet, whether that's wise or not, in the sense they have taken upon themselves the task not only to remove basically pretty much all elements of risk from the lives of Europeans, to ensure, whether it's like financial health, anything might be, but also basically to deliver a good life and an environment, and basically to deliver all good things. It's not your task as an individual, it's the task of the state to ensure you have all good things. And actually, I think in many ways you can give them a compliment and say they do quite a good job of it. But one of the downsides is they're just enormous machines. And changing any little thing is not a small task. It's the difference between a Ford T and a Ferrari. And you can look at a Ford T and you can say, well, let's move that bit a bit to the left and then we can stick this bit in. And you could probably do it. I used to have a very old Volkswagen and I could kind of look at it and say, twist that bit. Nothing much happens. You turn the tiniest knob on a Ferrari and you can guarantee your engine will make a strange noise and pretty soon blow up. And I don't use a Tesla as an example because, of course, electric cars are very simple. And it does make me think that maybe this is the natural curve of things, as when a model reaches a level of utterly complex perfection, when it becomes just a beautiful, a sort of a perfect example of its sort, an ideal. Maybe the only thing remaining is for that model to come to an end and be replaced by something much, much simpler. And maybe that's the way we're going. But at the moment, European states are kind of like Ferraris, if I dare say it, in the sense that they're just really complex. And they're not being able to adapt. So they're not being able to make changes to quite simple requirements. I mean, I got 2 or 3 minutes left?
2.
Okay. Might be 3. In the Netherlands, there's a big deal about housing. There's a terrible housing crisis. And it's true, there is a housing crisis. That's quite real. But it's not an absolute housing crisis in the sense that there are enough physical buildings that if you could just move people around, and there's enough brown sites that are, empty buildings you could build on, it's solvable, but it's not being solved. Now, there are a lot of constraints from Europe. You can't limit internal migration. There's a lot of people coming to the Netherlands because there's a labour shortage. They say you can't because of Schengen, open borders, free movement, etc., etc. They can't build anything because they have a terrible pollution problem because it's so densely populated, and pollution rules basically prevent almost any economic activity because they are strict and it's quite a polluted country. There are solutions. There are ways of getting around this, but there are ways of getting which require quite integrated, holistic adaptations to so many policies. You can't just build on brown sites because Dutch municipalities are so regulated in what you can use different land for, which in some ways has achieved great things. But changing that involves participation of 1,000 different civilian committees and changing of laws. It's just too complicated. And so what the states shout is, we can't solve your problems because Europe won't let us. And often as EU law, I think it's actually not true. You could solve the problems. You can't solve, but it is kind of true that they are institutionally incapable of solving the problems within the European constraints because the politics, the tradition, the institutional features, it's all too difficult. And they're failing. And they're losing their capacity to be problem solvers. And I don't think this is part of the story of the politics of Europe right now, is that populations are aware that states have lost their capacity to solve problems. And the EU doesn't show any understanding of this. They say, our constraints are quite reasonable. They're not too bad. This is perfectly reasonable law. Get on and do your job. You know, abstract level, it's true. But no one's perfect, and states aren't perfect, and they can't really do it within these constraints. So they're really being confronted with the consequences of their own failure, which is always, you know, puts you in a bad mood. But it's putting everyone in a bad mood. The populations are getting angry with their states, they're getting angry with Europe, everyone's passing the buck. It's creating, and nobody really has a way out, because for the state to say, yeah, you know what, we're going to like slim down, shrink, dump a bunch of our tasks, and then it'll all be much easier. But, you know, Europeans don't want that kind of a society. They like the state protecting them from everything. And I wouldn't want to say they're wrong, but that means it's very hard to see. The only way out is perhaps, as Professor Goulston suggested, that Europe does less. But Europeans have a low tolerance for diversity, I think, and openness. If they're going to be open with each other, they expect a very high level of shared economic and social values. Otherwise, they find it intolerable. So basically, something's got to give. And I think, you know, theoretically, it's all possible. What's happening at the moment is Europe is kind of like throwing member states in the deep end of demanding idealistic, sometimes cutting-edge legislation and saying, deal with it. You know, we all know the story. You throw them in the deep end, and that's how they learn to swim quickly, or they drown. Kind of touch and go. I'm not sure which way we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. And Florian, please.
Yes, thank you very much for having me again in this wonderful forum. After so many years, you still can bear with me. I actually have quite an easy task right now, because most of the things I wanted to say have already been said. And a kind of a leading motive of what we have heard today is the question, how far or how close should decisions be made from or to the individuals affected? And that concerns the American Commerce Clause, if I understand that correctly, but it also concerns the distribution of competences between member states and the European Union as we have it. And it's basically all the stories you told, everything you talked about so far basically comes down to that question. And going back to your notion of nationalization, and basically it's the same what you described for Europe, is a kind of invisible power that is pulling everything into the center and attracting more and more competences and jurisdiction to the central decision maker as opposed to the decentralized decision maker. And that has as a consequence that the centralized decision maker has overburdened himself to a certain degree, and this is what's creating the problems. So the European Union, I think most of us would agree, has overburdened itself, took on too much, and basically on many occasions has made laws and has developed policies beyond its original competences, and it has done so with the consent of the European Court of Justice, which has always been overly generous when interpreting the jurisdictional clauses and the distribution of competences. And I would like to draw your attention today to one example which is particularly difficult from a member state's point of view to accept, because just recently, probably you heard of that, maybe not, the European Media Freedom Act has come into force, which is an attempt to bridge cultural diversity basically by law. And this is something that probably most Americans have a bad feeling when they hear about this, creating freedom with law. And but this is actually something at the heart of the problems of the European Union in many areas, and I will try to briefly introduce you to that particular example. Why is Europe in difficulties? Well, we have external pressure, we have internal problems, and we have this aspect of taking on too much or more than they can swallow. We still don't have a European public sphere as opposed to a public sphere within the member states. The European political discourse beyond the Brussels bubble is still a national discourse. We talk a lot about Europe, for example, within Germany, but we very rarely talk with French people about Europe and with Spanish people about Europe. So there are European political discourses, but they're nationalized. And part of that is the language barrier, of course. We have English as the kind of common language. Some people even speak French outside France and talk to each other, but we don't have a kind of European media landscape. We have national media, which is still compartmentalized by language. And that is obviously a huge problem. And that is probably still the reason, that is probably the reason why we still don't have a European people. We have European citizenship, but people in Europe, or most people in Europe, apart from the really politically correct ones, still feel as Germans, as French, and not so much as Europeans. And obviously the European Union tries to remedy that problem. And one of those attempts to remedy that problem, or the first step of that, is the European Media Freedom Act. We start, because that's one of the elements in the heading of this panel, with constitutional principles, system decisions. Of course, we try to be as democratic as we can, and you already referred to the open borders, to the internal market, which shall comprise an area without internal frontiers in which the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital is ensured, as the treaty says. But what sounds like the dream of any liberal is quickly placed under reservation because the union shall work for the sustainable development of Europe based on a highly competitive social market economy, aiming at full employment and social progress and a high level of protection and improvement of the quality of the environment. That's also a quote from the treaty. And all of that is attempted through integration. And we have two, as you know, two different modes of integration. We have negative integration through individual freedoms that put me in the position to help to get rid of trade barriers between the states by saying that violates my free movement of goods rights. And we have the positive integration through the jurisdiction and the competence of the European Union to legislate. And the most important competence is the internal market competence, which basically gives the European Union the jurisdiction to make rules to protect and further integrate the internal market by reducing trade barriers through all kinds of harmonization of national rules. And they do so by making provisions that the member states have to translate into national law. And they can do so basically in all areas that relate to internal trade. And that, on the one hand, is a very powerful jurisdiction. On the other hand, it's a jurisdiction that threatens to undermine the distribution of competences between the member states and the European Union, because basically everything has to do with everything, and everything has to do with trade. And therefore, if you, for example, pursue health policy objectives, you can dress them up as trade policy objectives. If you follow media diversity objectives, like in my example, you can dress them up as trade objectives. And that basically destroys the distribution of competences between the member states and the European Union. And even though the European Court of Justice has said on several occasions this is not a carte blanche jurisdiction, they basically do everything to make it a carte blanche jurisdiction by not properly assessing European legislation. So the legislation has to be aimed at the removal of obstacles to the free market movement. It has to be proportionate, and it has to respect subsidiarity. Nevertheless, the European Media Freedom Act deals with the right of recipients of media services, tries to influence the structure of media in the member states, the financing of media in the member states, and they say because media services are nowadays delivered across borders, even though I'm not sure that's entirely true for printed media and for most of the media outlets, because we simply don't understand what our neighbors are writing and saying in television. And that's why we are more looking, and the obvious objective of that media act is obviously protecting the media diversity and cultural diversity within media. And they say, well, that's just a side objective. Mainly we're looking at the question of providing of media service across borders. But that's obviously so obviously not true that even the European Court of Justice shouldn't buy that at some point. What the European Union tries is to protect media diversity in countries like Hungary, Poland, pre the previous election, and so on and so forth. And by doing so, I think this is one of the examples where they're trying to where they are overburdening themselves with jurisdictions that they actually don't have, where they're trying to intervene into national cultural heritage and the cultural structure of the media services within one member state. And actually, I think that's one of the reasons why the European Union has problems with regard to its popularity in some of the member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. Let's jump into the discussion. We've heard many points about the importance of the European project and the ability to foster growth and integration in the institutions that need it in. And we've heard many points that suggest there might be a point where it's too much and there's a tension. So I think we have lots of interesting points to discuss. I sense, Alistair, you'd like to jump in?
Yeah.
Let's do that.
This is, as always, fantastic. Not one member of this panel has mentioned the fundamental transformation of the world in which we are living. We live in a digitalized world where frontiers between EU member states and all member states, the 193 member states of the United Nations, no longer exist. I was reading yesterday about cooperation between the Chinese money launderers and the Mexican drug cartels. What about cooperation between Interpol, Europol, the CIA, the FBI? Everything depends now, these days, on digital mastery of digital communications. All 7 top tech companies are American. Not one of them is European. Hence, the letter report that I mentioned mentions a 5th freedom, which puts the other 4 freedoms, goods, persons, services, capital, into the shadows. The 5th freedom is a renovation of innovation, R&D in Europe, because we are at the moment dependent on R&D done in the United States and elsewhere. Investment flows from Europe to the United States more than it does into our own economy. That cannot be right. And so I listened with interest to what Gareth was saying, and Florian. Gareth in particular, you're absolutely right. Your analysis, your diagnosis of the situation in Europe is right, but that is what we've got. And by the way, nobody, no European politician or national politician wants to abolish the Slovene language or the Croat language or the German language. We have to find a way in this modern world dominated by China, Russia, the United States, and the global South. We have to find a way in Europe, in the vieux continent, of working together in an unprecedented way. I mentioned the words political will. I know that the French and German intelligence services are working almost as one unit today in the face of the major threat from the Middle East. I know that. The British withdrawal from the single market, from the European Union, means that the British intelligence service, MI5 and MI6, work much more successfully with the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, the Five Eyes, than they do with their European counterparts. That cannot be right. We've got to rebuild what was broken. Hence, Keir Starmer talks about the first priority for the UK now, when his government comes into power in a few days' time, is to build a defence and security link with Europe. So what I'm saying is that we live in a digitalized world. We've got to come to terms with that. Goods and services are no longer separate. Most goods, high-tech goods, have services built into them. So the old ways of the European Court of Justice looking at these 4 freedoms, that's literally, it's for the past in a way. So we need to, and so Gareth, what is the alternative to the Digital Markets Act, to the Data Protection Act, to the General Protection of Data Regulation? What is the alternative to EU regulations? Not directives. We cannot have Slovenia, Finland, Greece, France implementing measures in a different way. Otherwise, we will not function as an economy. We will not grow the economy. If we don't have a capital markets union and a fiscal union, we won't have investments to give our young people and our immigrants jobs. Final word, migration was not mentioned either. Migration is the biggest threat. It's not just Donald Trump saying this. I'm saying this. Migration is a huge issue for Italy and Greece. You'd think it was the British that were suffering to listen to Sunak. It's absolute rubbish. We've plenty of scope for more immigrants in Britain. We need them, by the way, for our health service and our agriculture and our hospitality industry, just like you have had them here. Maybe not tens of millions, okay? But we need to think about migration. How are we going to assimilate people? How will we teach them languages? How will we produce the 4 million Turks in Germany as German citizens, rather than having Turkish members of the Bundestag and the Bundesrat? These are the challenging issues. They are hugely complicated. But please just let me read one last quotation from that report I mentioned. Today, Europeans no longer ask if action by the EU will increase growth, improve defence, or promote democracy, but rather whether the EU can help their state to meet the challenges of the 21st century, especially those, e.g. defence, which cannot be met by the states alone. Yesterday, the EU was seen by many, including the UK, as competing with and taking sovereignty away from the states. Today, the question is how best the EU institutions and national authorities can cooperate in the common interest. And there you have it. EU and NATO are one body in Europe. We don't have Malta, we don't have Cyprus, we don't have Ireland, we don't have Austria in NATO. But nonetheless, we need a European army. We must not ask boys in Kentucky to die for Latvia. We must be able to defend Latvia ourselves. It's a European country, okay? That's the aim. Trouble is we need 5 to 10 years to achieve that aim. But we must not always depend on the United States, but we must have the closest friendship, cooperation, and economic and political cooperation with the United States. But we must not always depend on you to look after our interests. That is, those are the days gone by. Happened twice, it must not happen again.
Bill or anybody else, please jump in. I think, Alistair, sorry, I can't resist, but the tension is the government in Europe, is Europe on the whole able to be efficient and effective if it reaches too much complexity? Or is it too small to do anything? I think that's the point to focus on. No?
I agree. I mean, if you look at, I think, I did a lot of work on the Russian gas price issue 18 months ago. And I was amazed how the Europeans responded in a regulatory way. By the way, Catherine, it will always be the case here in the United States that industry, technology, high tech will outpace regulators. Okay? We can't keep up. Regulators can't keep up. But the EU have done an incredible job in the last few years in trying to produce, is it good law? I don't know. But producing a regulatory framework for digital markets. Okay? And we are trying in every way possible to reassert, let's say, strategic autonomy without falling into protectionism. With China, we're trying to find a modus vivendi, because we can't go to war with China. We can't have total protectionism with China. Maybe you can, but we can't. And so we need a balanced policy with China. We need to be involved in Asia, but you're right, we don't have the resources. We don't have warships to deploy to New Caledonia when the Chinese take over the nickel industry in New Caledonia. We don't have the military forces. It's up to us to defend Europe first and to work with you where we can in other parts of the world when your attention is focused on China and the Asia-Pacific region.
Bill, please.
Yeah, I'm going to inject a note of philosophy into the proceedings, but it's philosophy with a purpose. My thinking has been very much influenced by some of the writings of the late Isaiah Berlin, who famously argued, he didn't put it this way, but I will, an analogy between the moral world on the one hand and the economic world on the other. And that analogy is that in both cases, you have multiple genuine goods that cannot be maximized simultaneously. And at some, goals can work together up to a certain point. Beyond that point, they become competitive with each other. And I think, based on what I've heard about the European experience, you have social goods that you care about a lot. You have domestic security goods that you care about a lot. You want to protect people against risk. And, economic vitality and growth are also very important, I would say fundamental, because without that, the other aims will become much more difficult to achieve economically and even politically. And so, what you're faced with, and we are faced with, I think, to some extent as well, is what happens when the other goods that we want to pursue come at the expense of both economic vitality and, as Alistair has just pointed out, the capacity for security understood as national security rather than the elimination of domestic risk. And Europe has decided to solve for that portion of the equation by not providing for its national defense. But in order to provide for your national defense, you're either going to have to grow faster or take things away from other sectors, which many European countries are manifestly unwilling to do. But even setting aside the defense conundrum, I do think that you're encountering, as we are, a trade-off between the density of regulation and the multiplication of veto points on the one hand, and the capacity for economic vitality and growth on the other. And I'm supposed to be the liberal on this panel, right? But I think that just analytically is a problem that's staring at us.
Yeah, okay. Florian, I think you have some thoughts.
There's a third option. That's what the Europeans try to do, what the Germans do. They provide for more defense by making debts. We enormously increased our state debt for defense in the last 2 years. And so we take away goods from future generations rather than from the current ones. So we can provide for social benefits on the one hand and build up a better defense on the other hand, which is obviously not something which is very desirable, but this is the easy way out for politics. And just one word to you. I know you are a great European and you are an admirer. No. Alistair, you're a great European, and you're the first one to defend a lot of things that I personally am looking at it in a bit more critical way. But talking about, for example, the gas price issues, you're taking examples that are connected to a huge crisis, and probably Europe does crisis quite well. But people are concerned with everyday life. People are concerned with the prohibition of sweets. People are concerned with the prohibition of tobacco advertisements. People are concerned with the Data Protection Act that basically weighs down smaller companies because they can't cope with the demands anymore, and so on and so forth. So the everyday policies that are thought out in Europe are the policies that make people life more difficult on many occasions. And this is why people are becoming more and more critical. If there's a crisis, probably Europe reacts well, even though looking at it now, a lot of mistakes have been made on European as well as on national level. But I think the level of regulation that there are, and you mentioned a lot of the examples, a lot of the regulation that comes from Brussels and that forces member states to adapt and to change is what makes it so unpopular these days.
Sorry, can I just say, in a couple of days, in this city where we're sitting today, there will be a NATO summit which will discuss Ukrainian accession, Moldovan accession, the role of Turkey, which is a weak link in NATO at the moment. What we're talking about at the moment, in my view, are two things. We have to do two things which are essentially, as you were saying, really, and probably Isaiah Berlin was saying it too, they are not mutually reconcilable to a certain extent, but we have to reconcile them. Number one, the British and the Polish and the Latvian army brigades at the moment are digging trenches on the frontiers of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to preclude a ground war by the more numerous Russian ground troops than we in Europe are able to field. We at the moment have 300,000 men and women ready for combat within 30 days. The Russians have 500,000 ready for combat, most of them luckily tied up in Ukraine at the moment. That is the number one priority, is to prevent the invasion of the Baltic states and eastern Poland and Moldova by Russia. We are fighting a second world war in 2024, okay? NATO is in the war. Don't make any mistake about that, okay? At the same time, the world moves on. At the same time, the WTO has to work now with not 163 members, but with the, the cooperation of the willing. So we've got about 60 or 80 or 90 member states of the WTO trying to regulate e-commerce, digital technology, so that the world economy can turn. It's not really about whether Germans can eat the sweets they want or whether tobacco advertising. Yes, those are important issues, of course. It all has to do with popularity. But the reason why opinion polls today are finding that the European political process is more credible, more respectable than national processes is because of multiple instances of corruption, of lack of trust, lack of confidence. I saw this, if I may say so, in the debate last night. It was an extraordinary debate to watch in the 21st century, in this great democracy. It was an extraordinary and deeply saddening event, deeply saddening, that I'm going back to Europe on Tuesday, knowing that your democracy is in a pretty dire state. Why don't younger people want to go into political leadership? Why don't European people want to go into political leadership these days? It's because politics is discredited, okay? So you're absolutely right, Florian, absolutely right. But if you're in government, you've got to somehow, do like a circus juggler. You've got to keep the balls in the air. And the biggest ball in the air at the moment is the security and defense. To know what's going on and to take action to defend your freedoms. Because you can only eat sweets or smoke tobacco if you're free.
Just as we're taking turns. I mean, the tone appears to be, as Professor Goulston said, I mean, you can't have all good things. Sometimes there's trade-offs and you have to make choices. But that's probably always true. And what strikes me, though, is we appear to be in a moment where we are unable to make choices. So this is always the case, and you have a government which, chooses for lower tax and more business freedom, and then 5 years later someone gets in and says, OK, now it's time to redistribute and have some more laws, and so it goes. So the game is played. And, the pendulum swings, and you make choices according to the mood. But the ability to make any kind of functioning choice, because so many governments are just suggesting things that are just kind of stupid, and that's equally true in this side of the water. Maybe I think coalitions are fracturing, and all political parties are coalitions of often very disparate groups, but sometimes they're quite stable, and both demographically and because of things like climate and immigration, and changing views on economics and politics, is the coalitions are fracturing. And so you get people there's a phenomenon in Europe of kind of what they call wellness right, which is typically sort of middle-class women in floral dresses drinking herbal tea and having strong views on, all kinds of, in some ways being socially quite left, and you'd think, you look at them, you observe them in the park for half an hour and you'd set money on them being Democrats, but then you ask them about, they turn out to be also conspiracy theorists who are strongly against migration, and that puts them on the far right. And you think, and things are fracturing. and young people who are in some ways on climate left or centre, but they almost all take it very seriously. But often in Europe, I notice they have very little faith in the state. They don't believe that they're ever going to get pensions. And so economically, they come out quite right. And so this fracturing of coalitions means you just don't have any functional representation mechanisms. And so you just get governments that basically can't really do anything very constructive.
Please.
No,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to say that there may be some questions. From
Yeah.
the floor. We only
For sure.
have
Please
10 minutes left.
raise your hand. Yeah, there's a question in the back. Jan.
So can we encourage anyone with questions to go to the two mics on the side, please? Just, okay, especially since there's a recording of this.
Hello. Jan Sklinski from the LSE. I actually had a question to you, Professor Galston. I find that kind of analysis of the evolution of the waves of nationalization quite interesting, but I was wondering about two things. The first is, I mean, does it really follow from what you're saying that nationalization has gone too far, or is it more of a case that better nationalization is necessary, better procedures, representation, regulatory outcomes, et cetera, but the actually, and kind of following the discussion, the actual kind of difficulty I have with this, what's the remedy? Because I mean, listening to you, it sounds like denationalizing would be a potential way out of this. But it's probably easy to do that when it comes to economic regulation, right? We just let states and local authorities set standards on how to produce cars. But what about those deep cultural questions that we're now discussing, the kind of social issues, the environmental issues? Because thinking about the civil rights jurisprudence, for example, I mean, once a country has made a point of this being a core value of the nation, I mean, can you really kind of take the genie, like the genie's out of the bottle, right? Can you then again just kind of delegate this down and have divergence? And in Europe, of course, this is right now debated a lot when it comes to rule of law crisis, gender equality, rights of same-sex couples, right? Should we be giving the Hungaries, the Polands, the Slovakias, the Italys more leeway, more divergence on these issues? Would be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, as we say here in Washington, thank you for that question. And, I don't want to be misunderstood. And the difficulty with covering so much ground in 10 minutes and 30 seconds is that I will be and have been. Obviously, when I trotted out the Augustinian triad of unity in all things necessary, that then invites the question, well, where is it necessary? And that is a very serious debate, but we properly resolved the issue of fundamental voting and civil rights for all American citizens on one side of that line. He gestures, but fortunately it was just water. We're not going back, and we shouldn't go back. But on the other hand, the Dobbs decision has now put into play a very interesting question that implicates what we've been talking about in the past hour. Namely, do we need a single national standard on abortion, binding on all of the states? Or does the Dobbs decision give an opportunity for different views on the matter that are concentrated in different geographical areas to find expression? I find myself in alignment with the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who thought that the state-based approach, all things considered, would probably be superior. So that's an area. So I would say that the contested cultural issues are precisely the area where we should look most carefully at opportunities for denationalization so that everything doesn't come to a single contested point in Washington, D.C. And if we're looking for a new modus vivendi, given the depth of our cultural differences, I don't see how we get there without considering the virtues of federalism more seriously than we have.
Can I add one word?
Yes.
Can I add one word? Because your view also gives people a choice. If you have cultural diversity, people can choose where they want to live, and people can choose where they want to live and what type of society they feel comfortable in. And I think that is also, from a kind of individual liberal point of view, a much more sensible approach than having a one-size-fits-all regulation from the center. On many occasions, I mean, there might be issues that have to be solved centrally, everything to do with digitalization because it's cross-border, global, whatsoever. But tobacco advertisements, press regulation, abortion, all of these kinds of things, different cultural things, they don't need a one-size-fits-all solution.
Precisely.
Thank you. I appreciate the high civilizational viewpoints. My question is also for Professor Galston. It's about Brexit. I'm asking you rather than Mr. Sutton because I think I know what your answer would be. Look, one problem that both the US and the EU have, which is deeply serious, is the issue of immigration without assimilation. This is poison because some of those people coming in, they're going to change your values. Maybe they don't like democracy. Maybe they don't like a free market system. Now, it is my understanding, I'm not as much of an expert, obviously, as Alistair Sutton, that this was an extremely important issue behind Brexit. I do understand that at the moment, this was not an economic success. But do you think, Professor Galston, that nonetheless, the Brits can take that as a success in terms of maintaining their cultural identity and their ability to maintain standards within their tradition while the EU is having all these problems? Thank you.
Well, very quickly, the late George Bernard Shaw once defined democracy as the only form of government in which the people get exactly what they deserve. And I think Brexit is an excellent example of that. You know, if the Brits want to cut off their nose to spite their faces, there's nobody on the face of the earth who can stop them, clearly. But look, you know, I think good policy, like good law, is fact-driven. People don't come to the United States because they don't want to assimilate. They come precisely because they want to become Americans, and all of American history shows that that is exactly what happens. You get these clumps of non-assimilation if you have public policies that prevent people from becoming citizens. This is not an argument for illegal immigration, but it is an argument for allowing people who have come to a country, let us call it Germany, for example, to become citizens without waiting for generations on end, as the Turks did. And we don't believe in that kind of policy. If people come here legally, then they have a route to the citizenship that they want. And that opportunity creates multiple opportunities for assimilation.
Just because we have a Hindu Prime Minister and a Muslim First Minister of Scotland doesn't mean we have an integrated society.
Well, fair enough.
Okay, Gareth, please.
Shall we take the last question?
Yeah, let's take the last question and then wrap it up.
One quick question, centralization versus federalization. Bill and Alistair, I mean, looking at Europe, I would say if you agree on a concept of values, you must actually follow through. And you cannot let Poland or in former times or Hungary or Slovakia, curtail their independence of the judiciary and so on. And to the United States, Bill, abortion, yes, theoretically you could leave it to the states, but practically it means that women that go from one state to the other fear that they might be surveyed, that they will be reported. So where does that lead to if you don't have a national rule how to deal with abortion and leave it to the states and women really have to shoulder all the burden?
Yeah, oh Lord. Yeah.
I have no choice but to keep this briefer than the question demands. The idea that any state would seek to limit the mobility rights of their citizens, is an extraordinary breach of national guarantees in the United States that are fundamental, right? And so when states go too far in restricting the rights of individual citizens to move to legal or economic regimes that they prefer, I think here, Florian, Becker, and I are in complete alignment. That is a bridge too far, and the national government has no choice but to slap them down, which I hope they will. And the states, having made decisions about affairs within their own borders, are in no position constitutionally to limit the rights of their own citizens to choose for themselves alternative venues within which they can achieve the goals that they think are fundamental. Does this impose more burdens on some than others? Yeah. Yes, it does. But the alternative is worse, right? And so I think, for example, that if a member of the US military finds herself sent to a base in a state that does not permit abortion, the military is right on policy grounds to facilitate the temporary movement of that person to an area where that right can be enjoyed. And so the national government, in order to defend this federalist regime that I'm talking about, has to prevent states from limiting mobility rights, and number two, has to act affirmatively to make the exercise of those rights possible for the people under its jurisdiction, such as military personnel. This problem is not insoluble if you're of a mind to solve it. Will it be perfect? No. But if the only permissible legislation is perfect legislation that distributes rights and burdens equally to all, you won't do anything.
Thank you for that. I think we have another question, but if I may suggest, why don't we take that question during the break? And we haven't solved the European questions here today, but we have at least laid them on the table, and there's lots more that can be discussed.